We begin with first hopes of a breakthrough over the war in Ukraine. President Vladimir Zelensky's office says it will hold talks with Russian officials at the border with Belarus. Russia says its delegation has flown in for the talks. It's not clear when negotiations might begin. In other developments, President Vladimir Putin has put Russia's nuclear forces on alert in an escalation of tensions with the West. The U.S. has accused him of manufacturing threats. Fighting continues on the ground in Ukraine. Russian forces have attacked fuel depots, and there are reports of explosions outside the capital, Kyiv. The mayor says there are no Russian troops in the city. Battles are still going on around other population centers. For more, let's bring in DW correspondent Nick Connolly, who is in Vinnytskaya in western Ukraine. Nick, why has President Zelensky agreed to talk with Russia now?
I think it's really important also for the Ukraine's diplomatic efforts, even if this doesn't reach any results, just to show that Ukraine is open to negotiation, is open to a deal. I think it's all a question of on what terms are those deals struck, and also even on what terms are those talks held. So the Russian side today arrived in the Belarusian provincial city of Gomel, which is just near the Ukrainian border. It's in the region from which attacks are still being launched on Kyiv every day. And they were expecting the Ukrainians to cross the border into a country, Belarus, which is basically supporting this Russian military effort with supplies, with access to its bases. And the Ukrainians it was expected by the Russians would just arrive to sign some kind of capitulation and give in to all Russia's demands. That was also something that the Ukrainians weren't going to agree to. So I think this was an attempt by the Russians to kind of show the world, look, the Ukrainians just aren't interested in constructive dialogue. That's why we have to fight this war, because they're not turning up for these talks we're offering them. So Volodymyr Zelenskyy trying to show the rest of the world that Ukraine deserves support, that it is trying to find a solution, but it is not going to be dictated to from Moscow how these talks happen and where they happen. I think it's just pretty extraordinary to imagine, going for talks in a country that is helping another country to attack you.
Regardless of how these talks end up evolving, is there any indication about when these supposed peace talks could take place?
I think it's a bit early to think about dates for now. There's lots of conflicting messaging going on about when that's going to happen, but the readiness is there, but fighting continues. So I think it's kind of hard to see how they're going to really reach any results while people are still dying in Kyiv.
It's a really difficult question, especially given what you just said, Nick, but what can we expect from these talks? Too early to say?
I mean, the Russians are going all out. Their demands from Ukraine, as it was put by top Russian officials and Putin, was denazification and demilitarization of Ukraine. Get rid of Ukraine's military so it can't defend itself in future. And they basically branded Ukraine's entire leadership as neo-Nazis, which is fairly extraordinary given that they got to power through democratic elections. Ukraine's president is of Jewish extraction. The Russians haven't provided any proof for these claims. Basically, they were trying to delegitimize Ukraine's leadership and basically say, roll over, take our terms, anything else, it'll be war. So given that extraordinarily aggressive negotiating position, it's very hard to see where a deal can be struck. But I think for now, it's about showing the outside world that Ukraine is willing to talk, even though these conflict and the shooting goes on. Whether it actually achieves anything, I think, is questionable.
That's Nick Connolly there in Ukraine. Many, many thanks, Nick. A turning point in the history of our continent. That's how Chancellor Olaf Scholz described Russia's war against Ukraine. Speaking to a special session of Parliament, the German leader announced a raft of policy changes that would have been unthinkable just days ago. Germany will drastically strengthen its military and move quickly to eliminate its reliance on Russian energy exports. He put the blame squarely on Russian President Vladimir Putin, who he said had brought decades of peaceful coexistence to an end. The German chancellor earlier today.
Putin
wants to create a Russian empire. He wants to reconfigure Europe according to his own ideas, and he does not hesitate to use military violence. We see this today in Ukraine. So we must ask ourselves what capabilities Putin's Russia has, and what capabilities do we need to meet this threat today and in the future. We must invest more in the security of our country to defend our freedom and democracy.
zu schützen. Wir werden von nun
From now on, year for year, more than 2% of our GDP will be invested in defense.
I'm joined now by our chief political editor, Michaela Kufner. Michaela, I think it's probably safe to say that this was a historic moment for German foreign and defense policy.
Absolutely. This is a paradigm shift in German defense policy. Frankly, we've seen more change in that in the past 24 hours than in the previous 24 years. That is now safe to say. It started when Saturday evening we got news that Olaf Scholz is now planning for Germany to directly deliver weapons to Ukraine, although we're not sure yet in which shape or form that handover will actually take place. And then today we heard from a Social Democrat chancellor whose chief whip in Parliament is really leaning in the direction of having tried to understand Russia in the past, more of a pacifist kind of angle. Well, he, out of all people, now announced these 100 billion on top of the ordinary defense budget. That's twice, more than twice the current defense budget here in Germany. And he's also agreed to above 2% of GDP going into defense, the latest as of 2024. This is something Donald Trump tried to get the Germans to move towards throughout his tenure and failed. And this has all just happened over the past 24 hours.
You make mention of the agreement to send weapons to Ukraine, another major sea change. Is Russia's war rewriting European security policy?
Yes, it is. Olaf Scholz said we've woken up in a new era, and that's how it truly feels. Also speaking to MPs here in German Parliament today, amongst the biggest skeptics that having a deterrent, having a strong military really would be a way forward in such modern times, particularly in relation with Russia, which geographically is so important to Germany and Europe. It is now sunk in from one day to the other that the limits of dialogue have been reached. In fact, we heard direct appeals towards the Russian people. All politicians speaking here today were at great pains to differentiate between Russia and Vladimir Putin, calling it Putin's war and not Russia's war on Ukraine, leading to basically Olaf Scholz predicting that also in Russia, democracy and freedom would prevail in the end. Well, this is very much sounding like those who are against Vladimir Putin to now stand up to him within his own country.
You well know, Michaela, there have been large protests here and abroad demanding more help for Ukraine. What role does public opinion play here?
Well, it does play a huge role, but frankly, what we heard here today didn't wait for any opinion polls. Germans are very conservative, very restrained when it comes to having any kind of engagement internationally of their own military forces. In fact, the whole of German society is, if anything, anti-military in terms of applying military pressure anywhere in the world. That's also why German Parliament has to agree on any forces being deployed abroad because of Germany's dark past. So yes, Olaf Scholz could be sure that a broad majority would back him on his actions, but this is really leading the way. This goes beyond what the now opposition, Angela Merkel's Conservative Party, ever would have dared to ask from their former coalition partner, the Social Democrats.
That's Chief Political Editor Michaela Kufner. Many thanks. I'm now joined by Ben Hodges, a former U.S. Army officer who served as Commanding General, United States Army Europe, and co-authored a book, Future War and the Defense of Europe, in 2021. General, it's good to have you with us. Germany has pledged to spend more than 2% of its budget on defense, something the U.S. has been pushing for years. Your reaction?
Well, obviously, I'm proud to see Germany, our most important ally, accept this responsibility. And this always had to be a decision by Germany, not something imposed on Germany. It had to be a decision by Germans. And so now the Bundestag and the German government accepting this responsibility, it's welcome.
I'm not sure whether you know this, but just very recently, Putin just just put out Russia's nuclear deterrence forces on high alert. What do you make of this?
Well, nobody should be surprised that he would do this. Of course, it cost him nothing to threaten the use of nuclear weapons. They've been doing this for years in all of their exercises. But it will cost him everything if they should make the terrible calculation to employ a nuclear weapon, no matter how large or small. It will cost him and Russia everything. I think it's also important to keep in mind that Belarus, Vice Ruslan, is having a referendum today. And that referendum will include welcoming nuclear weapons into Belarus. It'll change the constitution to allow nuclear weapons in Belarus. It'll change the constitution to remove the word neutrality from the constitution. And it will also give President Lukashenko immunity for life. This is happening today in Belarus. And so this increases the problem with Russian nuclear weapons.
I want to get back for a moment to what's happening on the ground at the moment. Did you ever think that the Ukrainian forces would hold, which is what they appear to be doing for the time being, against one of the most powerful armies in the world?
Well, of course, I've watched Ukraine now over the last 8 years since they were first invaded in 2014, and the United States and Canada and UK and Poland and Lithuania have been working hard with our Ukrainian partners to help improve their capability. But the real credit goes to Ukrainian soldiers. I have been so impressed with what's happened over the last 4 or 5 days. We know from history that the will to fight, the heart, is even more important than what type of weapons you have. I would also say that the Russians have revealed that they are not as good as we had maybe assumed just because they're large. They do not have any real experience at large-scale joint operations at the operational level like this. And so many of their mistakes they're making, their vulnerability, the logistics vulnerability is becoming very apparent.
Right. Not to sound like an apologist or proponent of any forces here, but based on what you've seen, is it possible Russia hasn't yet fully unleashed the full might of its forces on Ukraine for whatever reason?
Well, that's a fair question. There has been speculation that they were employing their, let's say, less ready forces, using Chechens, using conscripts in the opening phases in some parts. So I can't confirm that. I don't know how much of that is true. Certainly, they have used a lot of their airborne forces and their special forces in the early hours, and most of them were defeated. So there's no doubt they have more capability that they could bring into the fight, but I'm not sure that they are prepared for this logistically. I mean, it is hard. This is very difficult. The amount of ammunition that is expended in modern war is much more than we ever anticipate. Same thing for fuel.
Okay. That is Mr. Ben Hodges, former commander of U.S. Army Europe. Many, many thanks, sir.
Thanks for the privilege.
As we just heard, Russian President Vladimir Putin has put his deterrence forces, including nuclear armed forces, on high alert. In a video speech distributed by the Kremlin, Putin said that NATO powers had made aggressive statements toward Russia. He also cited economic sanctions that will cut off major Russian banks from international transactions. And from Vilnius, I am now joined by Constantine Agar, DW Russians Affairs expert. Constantine, welcome again. What do you make of this high alert order?
Well, as a former officer, I had a very big problem discerning what actually President Putin meant. He never served in the army, but he's commander-in-chief. The expression he used to indicate some kind of heightened state of Russian armed forces does not exist in Russian military manuals. A form which is called, he used an expression which is roughly translated like heightened military duty state. There are only 4 states of alert in Russian military manuals. Regular, heightened, threat of war, and full or complete. I mean, maybe he tried to say that this is heightened alert, because, frankly speaking, it's a very interesting detail. Nuclear forces are pretty much always on heightened alert. So what he probably wanted to say is that they are going to now fuel the missiles in the silos. They're probably going to give directions to the bombers with nuclear bombs that are on permanent duty in the air 24/7, actually. But we don't know whether it's true. And we don't know whether it's for real or whether it's an attempt to pressure the West and pressure actually the Ukrainian delegation at the peace talks into concessions, whether it's a threat to basically gain more leverage or not.
Is this a sign that Putin is getting desperate? The war has not gone according to plan so far.
Well, I suspect that he should be thinking about doing something. And let's hope it's not doing something doesn't mean nuclear war, but it's not going to plan. I think we already talked about it. I think it's frankly speaking a PR disaster already, and probably it is a military disaster for one of the world's superpowers not to be able to overwhelm a force which was described by the Russian commanders, Russian commentators, Russian politicians as inferior to the Russian forces. Everyone was saying just like 4 days ago, Russian officials were saying, well, Ukrainians will kind of run away. It didn't happen. So I think that he wants to gain more leverage, but on the other hand, it's interesting. The Russian delegation is going to meet a Ukrainian delegation on the border of the Ukraine and Belarus. And I wonder whether it's a kind of a tactic of diversion, which could well be the case, or an attempt to start at least some kind of dialogue. My suspicion, alas, unfortunately, it's the former. And because Ukrainians will never agree to any demands for neutrality now, it may be designed to give the Kremlin an excuse to start an even more vicious campaign of, for example, shelling the cities with surface-to-surface missiles. That's what I'm afraid of.
That's Constantine Agar. Many thanks. We have some breaking news to report. An advisor to Ukraine's interior ministry says those peace talks between Russia and Ukraine have in fact started. Meanwhile, Russian forces are meeting stiff resistance as they attempt to push further into Ukraine. The mayor of Kyiv says the capital is holding its defensive lines and there are no Russian troops in the city. And after reports of heavy fighting in eastern Kyiv, the regional governor says Ukrainian forces have retaken full control of the city. Russia's latest attacks have targeted civilian infrastructure and the military.
Chaos at an oil depot in Valsikiv, just outside of Kyiv. Emergency services battled to the early morning after Russian rocket fire destroyed the facility. It's just one of the many targets of Russian fire overnight. That night was hard. What did they do? This is revenge. The people rose to defend their state, and they, the Russian army, showed their real face. This is terror. They're going to bomb our Ukrainian cities even more. They're going to kill our children even more insidiously. This is evil. Russia has confirmed it destroyed what it called 975 military targets in the campaign so far. But many of its rockets have landed in civilian areas, killing and maiming bystanders. Here in Kyiv, civilians continue to seek shelter in the city's subway stations. There's little hope, it seems, for a quick end to the fighting.
Carolina Lindholm-Billing joins us now from Kyiv. She's with the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. Thank you for being with us. And if you'll forgive me and let me ask you a personal question, which is just simply, how are you?
Thank you. I think I'm shaken like so many others in many ways. I mean, I spent a couple of hours in the basement in the bunker last night, and I'm of course extremely concerned about my colleagues working in the east. I have colleagues in Mariupol, Severodonetsk, Dnipro, as well as in Lugansk and Donetsk and in central Kyiv, and they're spending a big part of the days in bomb shelters to protect themselves from harm.
And so far you appear to be safe, and that's good news. Does the latest news that Ukraine agrees to hold talks with Russia give you hope?
Anything that gives hope that can end, this military offensive that's creating a huge humanitarian emergency on top of one that already existed since 2014 and 2015.
Tens of thousands of Ukrainians are on the roads, as you very well know. What are you seeing from where you are in the capital?
So what we're seeing, we're in regular daily contact with internally displaced persons, local communities, local authorities in the country who are reporting about the arrival of Ukrainians who have fled from their homes. And what they're saying really is they need roof over their heads, shelter, food, blankets, like really key, basic necessities at this moment as they are fleeing and trying to figure out, where they are going.
And to that end, what is the UNHCR doing on the ground in Kyiv to help them?
So in Kyiv, it's very challenging at the moment because of the security situation and overall providing humanitarian assistance in this context where the security situation is so difficult and critical and unpredictable is a huge challenge. But we are working on establishing, a way to do this through IDP community groups, local authorities and partners who we've been working with over the years because the needs are immediate and they are really growing by the day.
We'll have to leave it there, but we'd certainly like to see you again. That's Carolina Lindholm-Billing with the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. Many thanks.
Thank you.
In Berlin, a demonstration calling for peace in Ukraine is underway. Police say more than 100,000 people are taking part. The demonstration is organized by a variety of groups, including workers' unions and religious and environmental groups. Protesters are calling on Russia to withdraw immediately from Ukraine and to respect democracy and human rights. In the past days, there have been numerous demonstrations across the world to support Ukraine and demand an immediate end to violence. Our political correspondent, Thomas Sparrow, is covering the story for us here in Berlin, where the demonstration is taking place. Thomas, generally, how many people would you say are there, and what's the atmosphere at this point?
So actually most people are now leaving, so the protest is in the process of ending. But a few hours ago, it was really extremely full right here in the center of Berlin. You may see the Brandenburg Gate behind me, and the other end of the demonstration was another of Berlin's emblems, the Victory Column. And between the two, it was really full. The atmosphere was a very friendly one. People were really all united in asking for peace. That's something that we were really able to see when we spoke to people from different nationalities and also different generations. So from a grandmother of 6 who was concerned about the war to families with young children who were asking for politicians to do more to protect children. It has also been a very international protest altogether from what we've been able to gather here, talking to people from different nationalities. They have clearly stressed that they believe that Putin's attack on Ukraine is not only an attack on Ukraine, but it is an attack on the international community as well. That's one of the reasons why they're now here in Berlin. Altogether, authorities have stressed that there are around 100,000 people who have gathered here in the center of Berlin. The images that we've seen certainly show that amount of people, but obviously from the ground, from what we can see here now, it is also slowly emptying. It was indeed a very important protest in Berlin today for those who want this war to end, who want Germany to do more as well, and who specifically want to support Ukraine.
Thomas, less than half a minute, but we sure saw massive people. Are they supporting arms deliveries to the Ukrainian forces and the exclusion of Russian banks from the SWIFT system, which could very well hurt Russian people?
Absolutely, they're supporting that. They've wanted for a long time. In fact, some of the protests that I covered in the last few days, they specifically wanted that. So many people are actually happy, at least the ones that we spoke to, about the fact that Germany has now changed course. So certainly another element here is not only about showing that they want peace, showing that they're against Vladimir Putin, it's also they want the German government to do more. They have wanted the German government to do more for a long time. And this is something that they clearly showed here in Berlin today.
That is Thomas Sparrow in Berlin. Many thanks, Thomas.